All right, what's going on, guys? It is Blake here with the Avid Entries, and I'm back once again, continuing with more Shadows Before Dawn. We are on Chapter 3 today. Upload for this week. I'm hoping, once again, I'm hoping that this is sort of a trilogy segment for the author's backstory. Like, hopefully we can get into the nitty-gritty actual topics and steps and teachings of the book, chapter 4 and onwards, but I'm not really sure how long the origin story background goes, but I do believe that it's probably going to end after chapter 3. This one, surprisingly, is actually longer than chapter 2, so this is going to be a little bit longer of a video, I think. I have pretty much a lot of time to read today, but yeah, it is. What time is it? It's like 6:30. But I think I have more time to read today before everybody wakes up and it gets a little noisy around here. So I won't read as fast, but hopefully I can kind of breeze through this without too much issue. So yeah, there's a lot of segments in here. So yeah, I guess let's just get started. So chapter 3 is entitled My Gut-Wrenching Journey to Self-Love. So, first section of the chapter, in a prison of my own making. I eventually explained the entire story of my childhood and Doc and the cults to Blake, which only seemed to deepen his dedication to my healing process. When I landed safely with Blake and was hiding out, I knew that neither Doc nor any other cult member would come looking for me at first, because they would violate the rules of the bonding and callback programming that they had implanted over the years. If they had to come looking for me, it was a liability, and also it meant that I was the one in control. They were relying on my programming to cause me to return willingly, like a runaway dog, but I did not. I slowly took steps to regain my life. I found people and activities that I used to develop my own. As you can see today, I'm not sitting like I normally sit in my chair. My own self-esteem for the first time, but it was not an easy or straightforward process. As for Doc, some years after I escaped, a case was opened against him. However, as with so many other abuse cases, many years had passed between the time of my escape and the time that the case was open, which left little physical evidence. Faced with scarce tangible proof or witness, the district attorney decided there was not enough hard evidence to prosecute, and the case turned cold. For any further action to be taken through the justice system, additional evidence would have to surface, or witnesses would have to come forward. You might think this is where the story ends, but I can tell you personally that the road to healing extends much further than simply escaping a situation physically. I may have gotten out from under the control of my abuser, but I was still a shell of a person. I didn't have a life. All I had were the tattered remains of a life that could have been. As a young woman, I had no idea how to cope in society. I had no life skills. I had severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and I hated everything about myself. Truly, my abuser had not disappeared when I got away from him. Instead, he set up shop inside my head, taking up residence in me, and I was the one continuing the pattern of abuse on myself. I was addicted to cutting, and I was still suicidal. Nearly every life choice I was making at the time was self-sabotaging instead of self-loving. I was convinced that if I stopped abusing myself, that the bad in me would triumph over the good, and I would become a terrible person, just like the abusers from my childhood. I was convinced that the only thing that made me different from them was that I punished myself. As for Blake, who was so pivotal to me at the beginning of my healing process, he went on to become the right-hand man in the career that I forged. Today, we work together facilitating positive change throughout the world with the company and the nonprofit organization we founded. But I've come a very long way, and that journey to my new life wasn't easy. I had to discover a way to love myself, and this book holds a toolkit of the techniques and methods that enable me to turn my life around. So this segment is, this is another new segment. The segment is rebuilding my life through therapy. I was forced into therapy at age 21 by a man I was dating who could no longer stand trying to be in a stable relationship with me. The after effects of my abusive childhood were making it too hard. He looked me in the face and said, "This is not normal. The stuff you went through is not normal, and you need to understand that. I'm not going to be with you anymore unless you get some help from someone professional." He brought me to a rape crisis center and said to the woman at the front desk, "She needs to be here." They called the director into a room with me, and she asked me why I thought that my boyfriend's opinion was that I needed to be there. I began to open up about the things I went through as a child. I remember watching her facial muscles become tight, and I remember her fidgeting as I let her in on only a few of the details of what had occurred. She assured me that I did indeed need to be there, but she also said that the kinds of things I was talking about were way over her head and way beyond what they usually deal with at the center. However, she knew someone who specialized in childhood ritual abuse and said that she would call her up to see if she would take my case. Oops. Later that same week, I met with a specialist for the first time. She was warm and affectionate, which was in stark contrast to the psychologist I was used to. That affection, combined with her extensive knowledge of trauma recovery, broke down all my walls, and together with her, I began the process of rebuilding my life. Therapy brought me to the point where I could admit that I didn't deserve the abuse I endured as a child and that it wasn't my fault. But I reached a point at age 24 when I realized that therapy had taken me as far as it was going to take me. I knew somewhere deep inside me that there had to be something beyond the feeling of being a victim, beyond pity, and beyond trying to cope with PTSD. It may sound grim from where you are sitting today reading this, but suicide had become my exit strategy. I lived through each day by reminding myself that I could always kill myself tomorrow. I found that this allowed me to really focus on what I could do today to feel better. I did whatever I could to feel better and made feeling good the most important thing in my life. So I dedicated myself to winter sports, experimented with cooking, found places to live that felt safe, and started meditating. Slowly, I found that the mantra changed from "I can always kill myself tomorrow, so what am I going to do today?" to "I can always kill myself in a week, so what am I going to do this week?" Then it became "I could always kill myself next year, so what am I going to do this year?" Eventually, I realized that I didn't really want to kill myself anymore. Even though I struggled on occasion with suicidal feelings, those feelings were temporary instead of a permanent fixture of my life. After I escaped the abuser, I wanted nothing to do with my extrasensory abilities. I threw myself into competitive winter sports in order to avoid them. I tried to become as grounded in the physical world as possible. I still help people by using my extrasensory gifts once in a while if someone was in a desperate state, but as far as I was concerned, my abilities were to blame for all the pain that I had experienced, and I remained tortured by the fact that I could not get rid of them. I was still desperately afraid of the world. New segment: seeking love for the wrong reasons. Lately, I just need a ton of liquid whenever I'm reading anything. I think it's an early morning thing. All right. When I was 22, I married a man I didn't love because I wanted to be kept safe and I wanted to be taken care of. That marriage fell apart and was annulled after 6 months. Then, that very same year, I married for a second time. I got married for a sense of safety again. What I did not realize then is that I was really trying to use men to run away from myself. I wanted to be kept safe, not only from the world, but also from myself. On the inside, I was still living in an atmosphere of self-hate, so pervasive that I couldn't trust myself. Then, when I was 25, my son was born. Having gone through infertility treatment and having lost 3 pregnancies as a teen, I was desperate to of having a child of my own. Contrary to my fantasy, I experienced an extremely traumatizing pregnancy at birth. When we found out the baby was a boy, I had imagined that I would have a physically active jock for a son, a sports enthusiast, who would never have to suffer from the pain that I did. The love I felt for my son was unparalleled by any other love that I had ever felt in my life. But to my dismay, when he was born, he had a clear colored aura, an aura that looked like a prismatic crystal light. These auras, which, because of their color, have been referred to as crystal auras, belong only to people with innate extrasensory abilities. Lo and behold, as usual, the universe had given me the very child I needed. I cried for a solid 40 minutes because I was so afraid that because of who he is, he would suffer like I had suffered. Then it dawned on me that if I was going to teach him to embrace his own inborn abilities, I would first have to embrace my own. New segment, Scrat and his acorn. The year was 2009. My 6-month-old son was taking a nap. I was sitting on the black and white checkered linoleum floor of my kitchen, drowning in despair. Since becoming a mother, I had ventured into the land of child's entertainment, including a film by Pixar called Ice Age. The movie featured a saber-toothed squirrel named Scrat. The entire theme of Scrat's character is that he is constantly trying to find and hold onto his precious acorn. The Scrat character is on a perpetual yet ill-fated quest to keep his acorn. Just when you think he has it, his bad luck strikes, and some improbable turn of events rips it away from him once again. Scrat is haunted by Murphy's Law, which is simply put means that anything that can go wrong will go wrong to prevent you from having what you want. When you're a full-time mother, it starts to feel like your adult brain goes away and is replaced by Disney. Sitting there on the kitchen floor that day, I couldn't get the character Scrat out of my mind. The humor of watching him on the screen was tainted for me by some kind of deep grief and identification with his dilemma. Scrat was me. His acorn was happiness. My life was nothing but an endless, ill-fated quest to find and keep my happiness, and here I was on the floor, feeling defeated because it never worked out. Why doesn't it ever work out? I silently asked myself. I knew the answer. The answer was that I didn't want me. Living in my own skin felt like a prison sentence instead of a choice. I kept thinking to myself, how am I supposed to commit to something that I don't even want? New segment, I am where I am. It became obvious to me that I hadn't loved myself for a long time, if ever. I didn't love myself, and I didn't have the slightest idea how to love myself. I hated the idea of self-love. Having grown up in a family that prioritized selflessness, self-sacrifice, and service, I felt like the concept of self-love was a villain. Self-love seemed like the devil coming to destroy my goodness and destroy all the chances I had of being loved by someone else. It felt like I hit rock bottom. I imagined that this was how people felt when they were so pathetic and so destroyed by life that there is nothing else left for them to do. I had chased myself into a corner. All other attempts at feeling good in my own skin had failed. That was the moment that, like a person admitting to being an alcoholic, I admitted to hating myself. Admitting to where you are feels simultaneously like pain and like relief. It's not fun to realize you are living with an enemy. You are living with an enemy within, but at the same time admitting it feels like finally accepting something you have been resisting for years. The energy required to resist where you are is exhausting. Admitting to where you are feels like letting yourself float downstream after swimming upstream against river rapids for years. With that relief, I found a sudden determination how to love myself. I would try anything and everything. There seem to be lots of theories. People in the business of self-help talk about self-love all the time, but most don't. But most don't know what self-love really means. They can tell you all day that you need to love yourself and list reasons why you need to love yourself and even give you reasons why you're lovable. But no one is taught about how to love yourself or what self-love looks like on a practical level. Very true. Thus my search for self-love left me even more frustrated than I was to begin with. Ultimately, I was left with the question, what makes people who love themselves different from people who don't? I knew that those differing qualities and behaviors would spell out in certain terms what it would take to love myself. Many of the stereotypical self-help techniques for proving self-worth simply didn't work for me. It felt like I was trying to chip away at an Alaskan glacier with a grapefruit spoon. Affirmations made me feel worse. I would sit down at the kitchen table and try them. I'd write, "I love myself" 100 times on a sheet of paper and try to feel the words as I wrote them. But as I wrote them, it was as if my brain was saying back to me, "You don't really think I'm this stupid, do you?" I could repeat the words "I love myself" all day long, and they would still be a lie. But later that year, I had my very first self-love breakthrough. New segment, the water glass. Being an extrasensory, I actually visually observe the effect that being an extrasensory, I can actually visually observe the effect that thoughts have on things and the effect that the frequency of one thing has on another thing. I can literally see how thoughts like "I am never going to be good enough to feed" I can literally see how thoughts like "I am never going to be good enough" feed right into the stomach area and create conditions like gastritis and ulcers. I choose not to drink tap water if I can help it because I see the way the chemicals and the pipes affect the energy of the water. As I mentioned in the beginning of this book, the line between thought and reality, physical and non-physical, does not exist for me. Even so, in the powerlessness of my self-hating condition, I had overlooked an amazing opportunity. One night, I decided to go to the city library to stock up on movies. I've always loved documentaries, and that day, I was drawn to one called Water, the Great Mystery. In the film, they talked about the idea of structurizing water. The documentary demonstrates what I have always observed, which is that everything that is around the water influences the water, and that your body, being such a high percentage of water, works the same way. In the documentary, they took the structurized water and poured it into an ocean with the idea that the structurized water would positively affect the water in the ocean. I paused the movie halfway through and flew around the house looking for a pen and paper with all my bells and whistles going. I couldn't believe I had missed something so obvious. I knew I couldn't focus positively toward myself enough to love myself, but I could focus positively towards something else. The idea of finding things to like about myself turned my stomach. However, I could look at my son and find a zillion things I loved about him. It stood to reason then that I could take a glass of water and think about everything I love about my son and direct that heart-bursting affection and positive focus that I feel for him into the water. Then I could drink the water. I felt like a war general who had just conceived of the self-love Trojan horse, like a reverse poison. I could restructurize water in my body that had been programmed with self-hate by inundating it with the vibration from the glass of water that I had infused with love. I wasn't sure what reaction I would have, so I was afraid to try out my little experiment that night. But during my son's nap time, the very next day, I got the courage to give it a try. New section, Teal, the guinea pig. History is filled with great minds such as Benjamin Franklin, Jonas Salk, and Albert Hofmann, who tested their hypothesis by performing experiments on themselves. I have always taken the same approach with my own ideas. The day after my hypothesis took shape, I stood in the kitchen in a state of mild panic. Granted, I wasn't going to fly a kite in a thunderstorm like Benjamin Franklin did, but everything in my body was screaming, "Run away," as if I were about to make a major mistake. An internal tug-of-war raged as I poured the water and started to focus on it started to focus on it, all the things I love so much about my son. When the timer went off at 5 minutes, I lifted the cup to my lips as if I was taking medicine, drank it as fast as I could. I expected that I would instantly feel good, like being full of eternal daylight. Boy, was I ever wrong. I immediately started shaking. I felt sick to my stomach. My whole body flushed instead of throwing up, I started sobbing. My body started purging grief that had been suppressed within me for years. I felt quite literally like I had been purged. I lay in the fetal position on the kitchen floor crying for a good 20 minutes. As my crying subsided, I felt this overwhelming sensation of relief. I felt grounded. I took a walk and realized that I felt the hint of inner peace for the very first time. I didn't feel ecstatic, but I also wasn't desperate to find an escape from myself. So I decided that I would carry on with my little experiment and do it every day for a month at the same time each day. For the first week, I had the same reaction. Drinking water felt like a chemical reaction. The two violently repelling energies were at war within my body, and after the first week, the reaction I had to exercise gradually decreased. Acclimatizing? Is that a word? Acclimatizing? I don't know how that's actually pronounced. I think it's pronounced acclimatizing. I was acclimatizing to the unfamiliar frequency of love. Then funny things began to happen. External changes started taking place. I complimented my own cooking in front of a friend, something that would have thrown me into a guilty self-hate spiral before, but this time it didn't feel wrong. I tried out affirmations to discover that they weren't as hard to believe as they had been before. I could say, I like the color of my skin, and really mean it. The angry voice in the back of my mind that would say things like, you're too difficult for anyone to love, or like you're one to talk, or nicely done, stupid, that voice started to go away, and my anxiety started to decrease. I was reminded of a time when I was randomly listening to a radio interview many years ago while driving across the country, and I will never forget what the person being interviewed said about the letters in the word anxiety. If you reorder the letters, you end up with any exit, which is essentially what anxiety is. It's the state of trying to find an exit you can get away from something. I could see how my anxiety was caused by the fact that I had been trying to find any exit to escape myself. And as my rudimentary self-love practice progressed, my desire to get away from myself slowly began to fade away, and with it, so did my anxiety. By coming in the back door of my own self-hate through this practice of drinking water that was infused with love, all the other practical how-tos of self-love became easier to do. By coming through the back door, I had broken down the heavy walls designed to keep love out, and from that point on, I found I could take a front door entry approach to self-love, set out on a mission to find every single ingredient that I could in order to design the perfect recipe for creating self-love. New segment, calling off cutting. Let me check the time real quick. All right. One of the most debilitating physical consequences of my self-hate was my addiction to cutting, and I knew that this would be my next huge hurdle. From the time I was 11 years old, self-harm had become a full-fledged addiction. Endorphins block pain and also play a part in our ability to feel relief and pleasure. They affect us much like codeine? I don't know what that is. Codeine or morphine does. When endorphins reach the opioid receptors of the limbic system, including the part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Okay. Including parts of the brain called the hypothalamus, we experience relief, pleasure, and a sense of satisfaction. We also feel calmer and positively energized. Here's the thing. When your body experiences pain, your brain releases endorphins. Endorphins both soothe and energize you so you can get out of harm's way. For this reason, cutting myself soothed my negative emotion. It is a coping mechanism that provides temporary relief from intense feelings such as anxiety, guilt, depression, stress, and emotional numbness, as well as a sense of failure, self-loathing, poor self-worth, or pressure of perfectionism. People can become addicted to chemicals that their own bodies produce in response to certain things with the same voraciousness that they become addicted to a street drug. So as soon as we associate the action of cutting with the corresponding feeling of relief, we create neural pathways in our brain that automatically compel us to seek relief when we feel negative emotion. And we do that by cutting. I know this feeling intimately. Like a caged animal, the cutter is in a prison where negative emotion, especially despair, hatred, and rage, cannot be expressed. So those emotional states are internalized. There is nowhere for the energy to turn but inward toward the self. When I was growing up, the burden of my life was that I had to keep a very large secret. I was living a double life, one with my parents and one life without my parents, in a very sick and twisted reality created for me by a sociopath. Well, technically sociopath, but it's a psychopath, who was supposed to be my mentor. Very early on, I was taught by my abuser that the calm feeling caused by punishment, either inflicted by someone else or by the self, is the light of Christ absolving you of sin. Cutting became my go-to coping mechanism. I used it whenever I felt trapped, guilty, desperate, or angry. And most especially, I cut myself whenever I felt like something was wrong or bad about me. I also used the excuse of self-injury to cover up other injuries that were caused by my abuser. New segment. It's just a phase, or is it? Unfortunately, and unintentionally, my parents added fuel to the fire with regard to my cutting. At home, my emotions were invalidated and I was labeled as mentally ill because my parents thought that I had no good reason to feel as miserable. That I had no good reason to feel as miserable as I so obviously felt. They thought the only possible explanation was that something was wrong with me. It's a logical conclusion that many parents make, but it turned me against myself. My parents reinforced the idea that something was wrong with me because I was cutting, but by doing so, they only added weight to the reason I was cutting in the first place. The psychologists and psychiatrists The psychiatrist didn't help because they kept telling my parents that it was a phase. They kept promising that that it was a teen thing and that I would outgrow the habit by the time I was 18. But when I turned 18, I was still cutting. Then they promised I would stop. Cutting by 25. But when I turned 25, I was still cutting. Then they said I would stop cutting when I became a mother, but I became a mother and I still had the occasional relapse and I would resort to cutting. Needless to say, my parents gave up. I tried every suggestion I came across to stop cutting, and I might still be doing it. But then I met my inner child. One of the leading techniques that is used in trauma integration involves a process where you consciously revisit their traumatizing memories, rescue your childhood self out of each of those memories, and then bring those childhood versions of you to a safe space where you can then reparent them. After I went to the police with my case, I was given a small amount of crime victims' reparation money, and it allowed me to see the leading trauma specialist in the state. She was the warmest woman I've ever met. I remember thinking when she walked into the waiting room to call me in that she looked a bit like a middle-aged Barbie doll. The first time she led me into my memories to interact with my childhood self, I couldn't stop crying. I could see how little and vulnerable I was, and also how pure I was. I had felt so dark and tainted for so long that it was a shock to see this vulnerable and innocent side of me. A new segment. A shocking meeting with myself. I was actually afraid of my childhood self at first. When I would mentally go to connect with my childhood self, I was too afraid of her to touch. I was too afraid of her to touch her. I'd have I'd have to imagine angels or warrior princesses rescuing her from the memories that she was stuck in and comforting her. Over time, I did gain the confidence to imagine myself holding my childhood self. I began to connect with my own inner child and I began to love her. I now think that inner child work is perhaps the very best emotional healing technique that has ever been discovered. By doing inner child work, you are not merely addressing a symptom, you are altering the very causation of emotional trauma. But my respect for this work was about to go up yet another notch. For some years, I had realized that the inner child didn't go away when I grew up physically. In fact, the inner child doesn't go away for any of us. It's resident within us always. It occurred to me that anything I do to myself now, I'm ultimately doing to my inner child. Like most cutters, I had a ritual spot, and that I would go to when I wanted to cut myself. My spot of choice was the bathtub. I riffled through my sacks of old pictures in the garage, looking for the most adorably innocent picture of myself that I could find from my childhood, and I taped it up on the tile wall beside my bathtub. Sure enough, the day came once again when I felt the frenzied craving to cut myself. I went into the bathroom, locked the door, broke a glass cup, and picked up the most intact piece of glass I could find. I stepped into the bathtub and saw the picture of myself as a little girl. At first, I was almost angry at the weight of responsibility I felt when I looked at that picture. I needed relief, but this little child in the picture was staring at me with trusting and innocent eyes. Trust that I was about to betray. Innocence I was going to destroy. I started thinking about what I was doing in the context of everything I do to myself, I do to the child within me. I began to get images of her playing and giggling. I saw myself grabbing her tiny arm and drawing the broken glass across her arm so that it bled. I imagined her crying and pulling her arm back from me, not understanding what she had done to deserve it. It made me feel like a child abuser. I started crying instantly at the tragedy of such an action. It was as if I reconnected with the innocence and trust that was destroyed within me as a child. I could hurt myself an adult, but I couldn't hurt a child. I dropped the glass in the bathtub and cried while looking back at that picture. My body still craved injury, but I could not bring myself to do it. I realized the tragedy of my own life by acquainting myself with my inner child. As a result, I began to see myself as hurt instead of bad. After years of thinking I was a lost cause and that I was unfixable, I saw that my innocence didn't go anywhere. Like the tiny flame on the end of a matchstick, it may have flickered, but it didn't die. I found my inherent goodness again. I found the part of me that couldn't be harmed by the people who found a way to harm everything else about me. Gradually, I began to reparent myself. By loving and caring for my inner child, I learned how to love and care for myself. It ultimately resulted in the end of an addiction that I had struggled with for more than 2 decades. All right, and that is the end of chapter 3. Just looking at chapter 4 a little bit, I guess it does continue on with her journey. I think this chapter is a little bit shorter, just a little bit. So honestly, I'm not even gonna lie. I don't know how long her origin story goes, her journey story goes, but it's very interesting nonetheless. So, in that chapter there, we got to hear a little bit about shadow work, or not shadow work, but inner child work, I guess. Yeah, that's very interesting that, she kind of took a picture and imagined the self-harm she was currently doing herself, sort of imagined her doing it to an innocent little child. And that's a very interesting technique. Yeah, because when you think about it, you wouldn't do anything like that to a little child, and it's like, it's almost shocking to just think about. I don't know, like you wouldn't even, just thinking about it, you wouldn't even put a child in a situation for something like that to happen. Like you take up hot pan off of a stove, you want to make sure nothing little, nothing innocent is anywhere near that hot pan. Like, that's what she's essentially saying, is that's how cautious, that's how gentle, that's how careful you want to be with yourself. So yeah, that is very interesting. Like, that kind of struck me a little bit. Yeah, so that's very interesting. What I kind of want to go back and reread, though, is the water glass part. The water glass part is pretty interesting because she said she directed her positive thoughts about her son, or that she had for her son. Basically, she directed a love for her son into the water. So I'm not sure if she was like thinking about her son while thinking about the water and sort of directing positive energy into the water, but I suppose that sort of restructured the water, and she sort of drank the water, and I guess the water was so pure and full of love that like it caused her to purge up the negative emotion inside of her, which now that I sort of when I sort of think about that, it kind of makes sense, because you hear people say that you hear people say that energy can't really be created or destroyed, but it can be moved. And that's kind of what I'm getting from that, is that what she originally thought was that she could drink the water that's positively infused or restructured or whatever. I guess she originally thought that she could drink it and it would sort of completely dissipate the negative emotion inside of her, the negative energy inside of her. But essentially what it did was cause it to move elsewhere, which is why she had to purge. I guess in her case, she kind of just cried it out. So yeah, that's very interesting, because I guess that's kind of the process of when you're taking ayahuasca now, which is, something that's been on my mind a lot because I've been highly considering it. But when you think about the concept of purging, that's basically what you're doing, is you're just moving that negative energy elsewhere. It's not dissipating, it's not disappearing, it's not ceasing to exist, it's just moving out from within you. So that's very interesting. So you can't get rid of those negative emotions, like in the sense that they just cease to exist in this reality. Like, that energy stays, it's just, you're just moving it elsewhere. So that's a really interesting thing I kind of took from that. But anyway, that's the end of chapter 3. So this is gonna be the last chapter that I upload for this week. Next week will be another 2 to 3 chapters. And yeah, I'll kind of recap a little bit. Hopefully I'll try and find time to recap a little bit more. So also for the chapters for next week, I would really like to record elsewhere. I don't want to be in here recording and reading not for every single chapter next week. So I'll see about moving to a different location or something like that. So we'll see what happens. Depends on what I have time to do. But next week is actually going to be a really busy week now that I think about it. So yeah, there's a good chance that the chapters might not be as spread out as I would like them to be next week in terms of the upload schedule, but there will be 2 to 3 regardless. It's just that I may not have time to spread them out. Next week's gonna be crazy busy, but we'll see what happens. But anyway, if you guys have any thoughts or comments on today's chapter, feel free to drop them below in the comment section below. I'd love to read them, love to check them out. If there's anything you want me to go back and touch on, like go back and read and discuss it at the end of the next video that I upload, let me know in the comments. And yeah, if you enjoyed it overall, please sure to drop a like and sub to the channel and hit the bell so you know when the next chapter is uploaded. And yeah, until next time, I will be seeing you guys. Take care.